All right, welcome everyone. So we're just going to hop right back into it. And if folks want to come up and grab seats in the front, you're welcome to it. I am still Eli Dvorkin, but I'm going to introduce who's joined me on the stage for our final panel today. I cannot give you their full bios or we won't have time for the conversation. You can read about them in your packets, but I'll just mention very briefly, we are joined today by Molly Wasso-Park, who is the CEO of the New York City Housing Partnership and the former commissioner of the New York City Department of Social Services. Welcome, Molly, great to have you. We're joined also by Maria Torres-Springer, the president of the Charles H. Revson Foundation and former first deputy mayor of New York City, among many other roles in public service. Welcome, Maria, great to have you. And also by David Jones, the president and CEO of the Community Service Society. Welcome to the three of you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
No, it's a pleasure.
Yes, I think a round of applause is warranted. For collectively the many, many decades of public service represented on this panel. So thank you all truly for the work that you do. So we want to hop into a conversation today that will deepen and I think take this morning's conversation in a new direction. We've heard a lot already today about what it would take to leverage our housing policy as a city to advance economic mobility through home ownership, through opportunities for wealth preservation and asset protection, so many different dimensions of this challenge and this opportunity as a city. But we want to open up a different conversation, one that I think expands the ideas of how to leverage our housing policy in a new way, and that is around opening doors to opportunity-rich neighborhoods. When I think about this particular topic, look, it's no surprise that opportunity is unevenly distributed across New York City. But as a couple of my colleagues have alluded to earlier, research from Raj Chetty and others on his team suggests that where families live does have a powerful effect on long-term economic mobility. Maybe not for the adult in that household today, but absolutely for their children in the future. So if we take that seriously, that not only do we have this uneven landscape of opportunity in New York, but that where you live can have a profound impact on the trajectory of your children in the future, what should that mean in practice for New York City's housing policy to open more doors to opportunity? And maybe Molly, just because you're right next to me, I'll start with you, and we can go from there.
Sure. I think the obvious answer is you can build housing in neighborhoods that are already meet whatever your definition of high opportunity is, and that's a whole other conversation, but let's sort of assume for the moment that we've defined what that looks like. You can build there. Tends to be more expensive, so there is a trade-off between the how much and the where, but that kind of fair housing policy is really important and has been for the city, going back to at least since Maria was commissioner at HPD. I think there's a real piece around investing in neighborhoods that don't meet the metrics of high opportunity. How do we make more of those neighborhoods achieve those goals that we want, right? So whether it's investing in schools and parks and libraries and other kinds of things. I think particularly in a place like New York City, transit is a huge piece of this because very few of us, spend all of our time in a given neighborhood, right? We all get on the subway and go to different places. And, we're talking about young people, even in New York, schools are much less geography based than they are in other parts of the country. So transit matters. And then, the research that's been done elsewhere is very much dependent on vouchers, and New York City has a much more complex voucher landscape than exists elsewhere because we do have a really robust city-funded voucher program. Vouchers are a piece of it, I think, and they continue to be a piece of it. I will acknowledge they aren't going to be the be-all and end-all, both because of supply constraints. So with CityFEPS, the city-funded voucher program, for example, at any given point in time, there's between 11 and 13,000 households in the shelter system with a voucher who are looking for a place to use it. So if we don't solve supply, we're not going to, vouchers are only going to go so far. But also because people really depend on their social capital networks, and those tend to be in the neighborhoods where they already are. And so people don't necessarily want to go to another place because social capital really, really matters.
My turn?
Oh, well,
okay,
you're welcome to jump in.
No. So I agree always. This has been my mantra for 20 years. I agree with everything that Molly Park ever has to say. But More generally as well, to just take a different lens on it, I think we unlock more doors to opportunity through our housing policy if we think anew, differently, maybe more ambitiously about the goals of our housing policy. And for a very long time, and it continues to this day, of course, we judge our housing policy by how many units we create or preserve, how affordable those units are, how many shelter exits. And don't get me wrong, that work, we did it. It's incredibly hard already. But to unlock the type of opportunity in high opportunity neighborhoods and elsewhere, it also requires us to think of our housing policy as perhaps answering a different set of questions. Whether families, children actually move to places with better schools, whether the access to transit, to jobs, to childcare, to what we've called amenities, but are important components of any neighborhood social infrastructure, whether that is actually there. And I don't think that the work of defining opportunity is easy. I think it's easy to traffic in that language, but to really name all of those aspects from childcare to transit to jobs and then connect them very intentionally to our housing policy is a different orientation. I don't think it's impossible, but it would be a real acknowledgement, and I think a good one, that that housing is not just about where you lay your head at night, that it is, of course, and has to be about allowing families and children to access the type of supports that are critical, so that when we try to judge whether we're successful or not in our housing policy, it's all of the metrics of typical housing plans, but it's also asking ourselves 2-3 years later, are those families actually better off? And are we seeing income growth and better attachment to those services? I don't think we do that in this city in a comprehensive enough fashion, but it isn't just a matter of measurement. It really does become a matter of reorienting what we think a housing plan or a set of housing policies needs to achieve in our city.
Mm-hmm. So I think I'll echo some of the things said here. The notion of moving people out of many neighborhoods is not necessarily the right way to go, because networks of community, of church, of family really mean that most individuals living in poor neighborhoods have a whole network they're depending upon. Moreover, and this goes back historically, my father founded, Thomas Jones founded Bed-Stuy Restoration with Robert Kennedy. And one of the things that didn't work, they tried to create a IBM factory for cable there. But actually, I think Maria talked about it. It was more people were using the transportation infrastructure to get to jobs. Where they lived and where they worked were connected because of the enormous systems we have in the MTA and the rest, which in some ways are unique in the country. And strengthening those transportation systems may be a critical point of getting people access. But I don't think it's simple to move people out. There's also a political ramification for this. The city is going through an enormous transformation in terms of ethnic groups. As has been mentioned, the African American community is contracting, but the Asian and Latino community is growing. When African Americans were concentrated, it led to a political explosion that had enormous impacts in terms of changing the city, changing the attitudes in the city. It led to Shirley Chisholm. It led to a host of other impacts, Charlie Rangel, the rest. Now that's shifting. And if I start to break up neighborhoods and, oh, you're going to move over to wherever, the political power may not follow where it should. And that has an enormous other layer here that we have to recognize, that it's not just housing we're talking about, it's the nature of community and new communities that are emerging that want to express themselves politically in the city of New York. So.
Well, you've set the table, David, I think, for a really interesting conversation. I want to unpack more of those pieces. I want to get to these ideas around how do we open doors to where opportunity is greater, as well as how do we create more opportunity where folks live today. And I want to ask about how we leverage the tools that we have. So Molly, maybe I'll start there. One of those tools, and it pertains to both housing stability and also, I think, opportunity, are voucher programs, federally funded, state dollars and obviously city money as well. There are over 120,000 New Yorkers receiving Section 8 vouchers. There are nearly 70,000 New Yorkers now receiving vouchers through City FEPs. The City Council's expanded that program this year. So I wanted to ask you about if we want to take what is now a significant both city dollar expense in terms of city FEPs, and obviously one of the all too rare investments from the federal government that are helping to support low-income New Yorkers today, and ensure that those vouchers are not just leading folks into housing, but are leading New Yorkers into opportunities for greater economic mobility. Mm-hmm. What should we be doing? How do we think about those voucher programs today? And how should we think about them if we want them to help us also achieve some goals around economic mobility too?
Yep. Great question. So I think echoing some of the statements that were made on the first panel, housing stability in and of itself is a foundation for economic mobility. And we know that with a household that moves out of the shelter system and into subsidized housing, which typically means moving out with a voucher these days, rates of return to shelter are very, very low, about 1% for a family, for example. And that in and of itself is the foundation for economic mobility. There's enormous amounts of research that shows that impacts of particularly early childhood housing instability has on that child over their lifetime. So the fact that we are investing city dollars to stabilize those families anywhere, I think, is an investment in generational economic mobility. I think vouchers, the other way that sort of vouchers just intrinsically play a value in that economic mobility is that they do recalibrate and reset as a household's income changes. And so you do have, people are paying 30% of their income, no matter what that is. As much as I am an incredible believer in the development of the affordable housing, and we absolutely need that supply. But if you were in a LIHTC building and your income goes down for whatever reason, your rent share doesn't reset, right? And so there's actually a lot of data that people in affordable housing are rent burdened nationally. The number, and this is actually a few years old, is that about 40% of people living in tax credit buildings are rent burdened. So the voucher plays a role in sort of making sure that people have a proportional share of their income for other expenses, no matter what is going on in their life. City FEPs has not been traditionally treated as an economic mobility program, right? Outside of the aspects that I just talked about that it's sort of fundamental to housing stability is fundamental to economic mobility. I do think that there's some ways that we could make that a bit more of the program if that is the direction that the city opted to go. Since probably 3 years ago, City FEPs can be used anywhere in New York State. Very few people have taken advantage of that. There's a few reasons for that. I think a big piece of it is, as David was talking about, sort of people's connection to neighborhood and the local social capital. That really matters. When I was at DSS, we were also sort of when we launched the statewide City FEPs, we went with a fairly soft promotion of that because some of the outside of New York City communities weren't super receptive. But this is a way that, to the extent that people want to move elsewhere in the state, that is a tool. Something else that we did while I was at DSS was that we project-based City FEPs, so it could actually be used for development. And I think that provides an opportunity to create housing that is dedicated for people coming out of the shelter system in a variety of different neighborhoods. So that's a tool that the city could lean into. Formally linking city FEPs to workforce development is a really dicey concept, and particularly in this climate where work requirements are getting attached to all kinds of benefits. So I think it is not impossible to say that you could fold a workforce development component into city FEPs, but I think you really need to do it in such a way that you aren't structuring it in a way that is punitive and that is actually jeopardizing people's housing stability in a way that, frankly, I personally believe that the work requirements that are now being attached to SNAP and to Medicaid are going to make people worse off rather than better off.
Mm-hmm. Just on the topic of vouchers, it's they're obviously administered by different agencies, and so each one has its own set of rules or supports different types of populations. And precisely because the attachment to a home is foundational to everything that we're talking about, the base measure of whether they're getting those programs are being administered properly is, did someone rent a unit? And the transformation that Molly is describing here, that is a potential of thinking about it as an economic mobility platform, I think it's really intriguing. There are a couple of ways that we could push on thinking about, well, what does that mean in practice, and then a caveat that I wanted to give in the end. What it would mean if we were really thinking about what are the high opportunity neighborhoods, or all of the supports that are there for some of the programs, many families, but probably not widely enough or consistent enough, is the help to actually move to specific high opportunity neighborhoods, recruiting landlords specifically in those neighborhoods, the type of coaching and counseling, the deposit support. There's a long list of things if you really wanted to make sure that connection to quote unquote high opportunity neighborhoods was there. But then you also think about life after the lease is signed. And so the post-move set of supports, the attachment to workforce training opportunities, to childcare opportunities, to all of the other networks and what exists in a neighborhood, that category of supports, not in all of the programs, and is, I think, a really interesting thing potentially to build out. There are already some programs, HPD, right, for its Section 8 vouchers has a family self-sufficiency program. It's a demonstration, it's a pilot, and it provides workforce training and financial literacy support to certain families. And as their earnings grow, there is a match in terms of savings so that it is the type of, the incentives are aligned, but that doesn't reach everyone. And for every good idea that is a pilot, getting to scale can become quite tricky. So those are, it's thinking about what the attachment to high opportunity neighborhoods needs to look like, the post-move set of supports. But here's the caveat that I wanted to mention, whether it's city FEPs or the other voucher programs, right now they are asked to do, each of these programs, so much. Their goals are to reduce the shelter population, to reduce rent burden. If you add, which is a very laudable, it's what this conversation is about, economic mobility, we always have to be conscientious of, can it really optimize for all of those things? And how much is that going to cost? And is that the right use of the public dollar? Or how do we involve all of the other systems that are critical to thinking about economic mobility? Because no program, city FEPs or otherwise, can solve them all at the same time. And when we expect too much without the resourcing or the alignment of different agencies, then they'll never meet their aspirations. And that typically becomes the pattern of well-intentioned programs that are trying to solve too many system issues, in my experience.
Just a couple of comments on this issue. So we've done reports on the issue of how people are responding to rent control, city FEPs, and there's strong evidence that people get real help out of these programs and staying in place. So that's one. But another sort of counter is that city FEPs and voucher programs are often not accepted, despite legal requirements that they be. So enforcement of these kinds of programs is going to be a significant part of what we're doing here. So against this background, I guess I'm bringing it out of housing to my critical worry about a generation of young people growing up in many of these neighborhoods. We have, I think, reached the highest dropout rate virtually in known memory at a time where the requirements of entering the workforce have escalated. So this notion that these neighborhoods are dysfunctional is in some respect a problem of a younger generation coming up with no prospects for engaging in serious and productive work. So I'm less worried about people my age, or even who have established themselves in where I grew up in Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy, as opposed to what's going to happen to the generation that is following, and merely moving those young people around like shuttlecocks is not necessarily going to resolve some of the critical issues that have begun to impact every news story you see in the Daily News and the Post. So again, this is not housing policy, but recognizing how widespread the problem we're confronting here. And if we don't grab that by job opportunity, which we've talked about, which hasn't been particularly effective, Section 3 in public housing has never really been enforced. I think I remember a panel we were on with Mayor Bloomberg where we were trying to get the construction unions to open their doors somewhat, which basically I felt shut down immediately. We didn't get anywhere despite the leverage we had. But we're going to have to break open some of these opportunities that may be available to a younger generation involved in reconstruction and helping NYCHA residents, particularly the young, get an advancement in those areas. Again, this has to be a broader palette than just focusing exclusively on housing.
Well, let me build on that a little bit, David, because I think part of what our thinking was, as an organization, Center for Urban Future, we're not a housing organization. We are really an economic mobility focused organization, but that's exactly why we wanted to convene this conversation today to say, hey, let's make sure that we're leveraging our housing policy, which includes billions of dollars both in terms of subsidy and in terms of investment, to be able to move the needle on economic mobility. So I actually want to ask, I kind of want to take your point, David, but turn it around as a question for all three of you, which is, when you think about the other ways that we could be leveraging our housing policy to actually address some of those challenges, you mentioned, for folks playing along at home, Section 3, you're talking about contracting opportunities within NYCHA, right? We're talking about billions of dollars that we spend to build and preserve affordable housing in New York City. But how much of that money is also flowing to immigrant and minority-owned small businesses in New York City? I've been thinking about leveraging housing to help folks move to places where the opportunities are a little bit greater, but also the investments in housing that can help create more economically mobile neighborhoods in neighborhoods that are currently low income today. So I wanted to ask all of you in a few minutes or so, and we will also turn it over to our audience as part of this panel. But when you think about all these opportunities, I do want to, David, keep the focus on housing, but open up to those challenges that you mentioned, whether it's out of school and out of work young adults, whether it's opportunities to develop more of our great immigrant and minority-owned small businesses in New York to help them grow and hire and have more of their own economic impact, whether it's through moving to opportunity or creating more higher opportunity neighborhoods in a place-based way, Where else do you see those opportunities? I guess I'm looking for specific ideas that you would like to see, the folks in this room tuning in, folks in City Hall today, in state government today, looking for specific ideas that might help to kind of bridge that disconnect between our housing policy and our goals of reducing poverty. What are some of your other ideas that we should be pursuing?
Getting to that, I think we did a poll. I had always been raised, there was something called the talented 10th, that the only way for African Americans to progress was college, the rest. And it was almost to the point where the notion of career and technical education was considered anathema. We did a poll. We have something called the Unheard Third, now it's named, and started to ask people what they thought of educational opportunities which involve career and technical. Overwhelmingly, and much to my shock, 80 to 90% of low-income people thought this was an interesting idea, that they'd like to see their kids get some skills that could be immediately useful and allow them to have themselves and their families move up economically. Career and technical has always been a dead letter. It's gotten some energy, but it's never really been accepted by many in my own community and elsewhere. But what we were finding in the poll, that uniquely people were starting to talk about this seriously. This is also the discussion of can people actually make a decent living when they go to college and get a psychology degree? I don't know, but I know that if you can become, I talk to, all over the place about this.
College student making me anxious.
Yeah, I know, sorry. But I'm interested if it's time that we start to look at the openings that are available, the 90 billion or whatever in unmet needs in public housing, in reconstruction and capital needs. Maybe we could get some movement here in terms of re-engaging a whole generation that has dropped out, sees no connection to what's happening in their schools, to something that can lead to serious economic opportunity. So it goes against my history, but it's starting to be something that, particularly as we started to poll new immigrant communities, they have no difficulty with. They aren't under this sort of, the only way up is if you become a doctor, a lawyer, or the rest. There are other areas here which lead to significant economic growth and stability, and it is directly related if we can get the housing system actively moving on this thing.
Can I offer a few specific ideas?
Yes,
so I think if the mission is that we have to make sure that people aren't forced to leave the neighborhoods where they have the networks and the connections, and yet we also want to make sure that zip codes don't determine people's future life outcomes. I think there's some specific ways, and maybe some of these are very kind of technocratic, but just from the point of view of what does it mean to actually put this in practice, every administration since I can remember has a housing plan, and every administration adds chapters, resequences the chapters to show, demonstrate, and then manage against that, right, what their priorities are. If the next housing plan or addendum to this one has a chapter that's not just, right now I'm forgetting exactly, it's a 112-page document, it's beautiful, but it has your typical chapters. What if it had a chapter that was really as rigorous and in-depth as it needed to be, specifically on economic mobility or specifically on workforce? It becomes a forcing mechanism. So when you are developing your goals and your programs and getting the money, the resources that you need, and aligning the agencies, it's not just a typical housing agencies, it brings in the economic development agencies, the educational institutions, so you have a chapter that is real and achievable, that the public sees, and you're held accountable to that. The second thing that I would do is really think about whether it's in a rezoning area, and having, with Molly and many others, negotiated a number of these, the investments that are negotiated with the city council on, let's say, hard infrastructure, that I think we're pretty good at as a city. Parks, sewers, I'm not saying it isn't hard, but it's always struck me that there's a real opportunity to have a better package, a better set of investments on mobility, on workforce in those areas where we are building residential capacity because of a rezoning. And that it's not an outgrowth of the EIS, it's just part of what we should be thinking about in terms of complete neighborhoods. And in those places where there isn't a rezoning, or there was one previously, but you're not really seeing the opportunity that we would all like, basically kind of defining what that looks like. I mean, we have so many indices of maybe health and neighborhood vitality, but if we really thought about what does an opportunity look like in a neighborhood, and it can't just be about crime statistics or housing starts or vacancies, it's all of the things that we really want and need in terms of educational attainment, in terms of access to jobs, the commute to jobs, and understood what that baseline was, and see if neighborhoods are actually moving. So that encompasses not, what it ensures is that we're not accepting that neighborhoods will permanently be low opportunity, because that's just accepting decline, and the trends that, as David has described, have led to the type of stagnation of opportunity for too many families. And then finally, I think it's actually pretty rare. This convening is a good one, but I think it's rare, and having overseen a portfolio that had economic development and housing, like housers and economic developers kind of coming together, it doesn't happen often enough. I'm not saying it's unprecedented, but the work of then saying, how do we, given all of the levers we pull, start coming up with new approaches or the synergies that are necessary, I think both programmatically and from an advocacy perspective, I think that would make a real dent in how we think about what a housing policy can be in our city.
Yeah. So few things to add to the list, and I think the first one is a perfect segue with what Maria just had to say. We've recognized for a long time that when we spend, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars on affordable housing, that is an opportunity to invest in communities. I think the concept exists, the implementation has been pretty abominable. Like, we put in a local hiring requirement and then sort of, and that is because we have the housers, we have the economic development people, and then there's also sort of a third group of the social service people who are actually, know who in the community wants one of these jobs and needs the training, and if they had the training, and could also, by the way, buy the boots and the toolkit and maybe help with the apprentice program, then is going to get the person into the job, right? So we need to build that sort of both the operational infrastructure that gets from the finding the people, doing the training, solving the logistics, and then getting them into the job. And that we haven't done that well in the past. And when we have done it well, it's been at a very small scale. I think we need to recognize, and many people do recognize, right, we actually have a lot of affordable housing in high opportunity areas because they weren't necessarily high opportunity areas when the housing was built, right? The Lower East Side, even 40 years ago, that was the Upper West Side, a high opportunity area, right? But there is housing in a lot of these large swaths of Brooklyn, right? Places where it was built, and we need to hang on to that. The affordable housing stock in the city right now is really struggling because expenses have gone up faster than rents have gone up faster than tenant incomes. I think the city is recognizing this and is building some, rolling out some tools to help the housing. We also need to think about the people who live in that housing already. Collections are a huge issue. In affordable housing, people aren't paying their rent, are not paying their rent because they're bad people. They're not paying their rent because everything is too expensive and they don't have the money to pay their rent. So how do we support the people who already live in affordable housing? I am day 3 as the president and CEO of New York City Housing Partnership, but this is on my agenda. And then, my last idea that I would throw out, and this is a much more pie in the sky, but our tools, all of our housing tools, vouchers, leases in affordable housing, are all really structured around the idea of that you have one nuclear family living in one apartment with one lease and one, maybe one subsidy. And that's not actually how people function, right? I'm not advocating for overcrowded, but there's a lot of varieties of shared housing that people use to get by, and they use to get by from an economic perspective, but they also use to get by from a social capital perspective, right? And if there was a way, and I did put some effort into this, my social service days, COVID kind of took over, and it didn't make it get forward, but to be able to say, like, these are two single parents who want to move into a unit together, and they each have a voucher, and if you add them together, you could get something in a very different kind of a neighborhood, and they could provide supports to one another in addition to adding the rent money together. If we can adapt some of our tools so that we can get beyond this sort of narrow nuclear family, I think there could be some value there.
Well, I love these ideas. I want to thank you all for sharing them. I also want to see if our audience has some ideas too. So if you'll allow me, let's turn it over to our audience for just a few minutes. My colleagues have microphones, so they'll come around. If you just put your hand up, we'll get to you. Please we'd love to hear your questions for our panelists. We'd love to hear your ideas for leveraging housing policy to unlock economic mobility. Just try to keep your comments to just a minute or less so we can get to as many as possible. Get your hands up high in the air. My colleagues will come around, and we'd love to hear from all of you. I can't believe in a room of 200 plus people. Throw your hands up, don't be shy. I will ask more questions of our panelists, but I already see some hands starting to go up. Great.
A microphone? I don't know if this is working.
Yep, you're good.
There it is. Okay. Thank you for your thoughts and your brilliant experience. And I'm just wondering if we can talk a little bit about workforce housing. And I'm thinking of, hospitals in outer boroughs often have a lot of land, and they could build affordable housing for the community, but also specifically for their nurses and their security guards and their non-doctors who make the hospitals function, but are living in Connecticut, New Jersey, because they can't afford to live here. Or police precincts. I'm thinking of one in Queens near the Flushing Airport. There's a lot of land. Why can't we build some housing for the whole community, but also specifically for our cops? When we're looking at the 2nd Avenue subway and there's eminent domain, is there any way we can have housing specifically for some of our MTA workers who, might be too rich for the affordable housing, but too poor for the market rate? I'm eager for your thoughts on that kind of housing.
Well, I think it's a great idea. It has been suggested, particularly around some of the, downstate looked at it, Kings County looked at it, and I think it is an important idea. The cost of living and housing for nurses and other hospital people is just, it doesn't exist. And you could make things. I think already there's discussion at the MTA about the issue of the 2nd Avenue subway and what kind of opportunities that's going to lead. And I never get this straight. There's something called value capture. The notion that if you're bringing new lines, and I think this is also the light rail system that's being talked about, Queens and Brooklyn, that there should be some recovery by the city from the owners whose property suddenly zooms through the roof because of these new capital expenditures. So I think it is the right way to go, both in terms of housing people in affordable places that support the whole infrastructure of the city. I think it's a good idea.
And one of the things that I have been thinking about in my spare time, because that's the kind of nerd that I am, is that the co-ops that were built in, 70 to 100 years ago by various unions, right? The amalgamated co-ops in the Bronx, the garment worker co-ops that on sort of the far end of Grand Street by the FDR, at least some of which have gone market rate in that period of time. But these were like literal, they sort of go to the original meaning of co-op in that like the development costs were put up by the people who are going to be buying into them, and that you were and they were financed with very limited government subsidy, some amount of land, at least on the Grand Street co-ops, and tax benefits, but they didn't have the same kind of capital subsidy or LIHTC or anything like that we put into housing, affordable housing now. And I think, looking at whether or not there's things that we can learn from that model and versions of that is, that is targeted as workforce housing, that allows people to build equity, tying into some of the last panel. I think that is an idea that is worth dusting off.
The only thing that I'll add is just making the distinction between workforce housing, small cap W, small cap H, and then large cap W, and are those the letters, and H? Because if the question is, should we involve our larger institutions, should they be in the business of housing, like hospitals, et cetera? Mm-hmm. The answer is yes. If the question is, should pension funds associated with labor, it's actually already happening, maybe not at the scale, but there are a couple of really interesting projects that were at least in the pipeline when I was still in the administration. The answer is yes. Does overall the work that many were part of being able to build housing in every neighborhood through City of Yes and otherwise and upping, does that help the overall workforce? 100%. It obviously gets tricky when you start getting into the models of it can only be for this type of workforce because of issues of disparate impact. Mm-hmm. And we confronted so many versions of that and thinking about what preference looks like. There is already a municipal preference in our housing lottery system. But those set of legal constraints should not prevent us from thinking as aspirationally as we should about who are the partners from a financing perspective, from a land perspective, who can help build the type of housing across the city at the scale that is needed for a wider swath of New Yorkers.
That's great. I would just add two other quick ideas from Cuff's own research. One is we have over 80 acres of surface parking in our CUNY system. There could be some housing there. And two, we've got dozens of New York City public library, Brooklyn, Queens, and NYPL branch libraries that are either under 10,000 square feet or face millions of dollars of unmet state of good repair capital needs, or both. And many more of those branches could be rebuilt into brand new, modernized, expanded branch libraries with a whole bunch of housing on top. So just two other possibilities there. Love to see some more hands go up. My colleagues are coming around, and we'll get to as many of you as we can.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. My question is about small businesses in the neighborhoods. They really bring vibrancy to life in the neighborhoods, and they increase the quality of living for small businesses, particularly storefronts. And we have about the same storefront vacancy that we had in Manhattan and all the boroughs as before COVID. But how do storefronts play into increasing the value of a neighborhood and making a neighborhood more livable? Because often my experience has been, especially with commercial leases in Manhattan, that the tax increases are not passed on to the rent control departments above in a mixed-use building, but onto the small businesses on the storefront. And the same thing with the corporate rent tax. So is there any opportunities for ownership, perhaps through the SBA 504, for co-ops and stuff to purchase and own the, live and work in spaces?
That's like a whole other panel. Yeah, no. I'm being facetious. Of course, like a lot of the literature shows that, to the extent that New Yorkers, they may not trust like government or big institutions, but there's an enormous amount of trust in their local small businesses. Mm-hmm. And all of the constraints that you mentioned continue to be real. There's a whole set of small business policy that needs to be looked at and refreshed for the way, all of the convulsions in how in retail and in consumer spending, all of that. But to bring it back to the nexus with housing, a few levers do exist. Again, when we do rezonings, thinking about what are the ways zoning can either prevent or facilitate the types of local small businesses being in new developments. In RFPs for public land, thinking about, well, what makes this a good project? In addition to the type of quality, affordable housing, income levels, but always we've looked at the types of programming that will be on the ground floor, community centers, et cetera. That's an opportunity to use that tool, again, to prioritize. I think that there too, in rezonings or in projects, it's not just, do you have the zoning, do you have the partnerships, but what does it look like to make the connections with existing entrepreneurs, with local anchors, and a lot of that might be working with local merchants associations, community-based organizations. That's there, but how do you both prioritize it, and how do you resource that type of work? And so what I would focus on, not to just name all of the tools, is it's the same thing with jobs. For your housing policy, you think about the programs, where the dollars are, where the levers are of negotiation, and those are, in my opinion, the places where you can force, incentivize, and then hopefully achieve the types of connections to job training, to small business services and development, and all of the other priorities that you might have, childcare and transportation, that are critical to this larger equation of economic mobility.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you, Maria. Some other hands. I think we've got time maybe for one more. Microphones are coming around up at the top as well.
Thank you so much for this event. As a Bronx resident and a homeowner in the Bronx, I feel that a real way for the city of New York to open the door to opportunities for homeowners, landlords, co-op owners, and everybody basically is to eliminate the cost of water on New York City homeowners and taxpayers, because it's unfair that every summer for 2 months, all the hydrants within all the neighborhoods are opened up and water runs for free, and that has a value on it that homeowners and landlords have to pay for. And it's unfair to all New Yorkers that some people get free water in the summer while others are burdened with a meter system in their property, and they have to pay for that. And I think this would be something that would help eliminate a lot of financial problems for small homeowners like myself, who only owns a single family home. And I watch gallons and gallons of water being robbed because there's a price on it. That's my opinion. I don't know if that's a question or whatever, or something that maybe can be looked into. But I think that would help the landlords too. And thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thank you. We can take maybe one more idea or question from the audience. Just make sure your hands are up so folks, my team can see you.
Is it me? So currently there are millions of square feet of underutilized commercial and institutional buildings throughout the city. Outside the city, yes. how could the city introduce a new program to unlock those assets to become a meaningful part of the housing crisis?
Did you say underutilized commercial?
Yes.
It's like 135 million square feet, right?
Yes. Vacant commercial.
Right. Yep. And one piece of that, which is over the last few years, was unlocked through hard-fought wins in terms of state legislation and local land use, are of course the conversion of underutilized commercial space into residential. Recent headlines about construction problems notwithstanding.
We'll keep that to the side.
Yeah, but it's actually it'll be interesting. We spent so much time, blood, sweat, and tears, finding ways to make the process of building and of converting, right, from commercial to residential, given the 135 million square feet of underutilized commercial, into residential. We have a housing crisis. And of course, something very unfortunate and knock on, wherever there's wood, won't result in any physical harm happens. And what I hope does not happen then is that we then layer on 100 new regulations in response to that, while well-intentioned, that takes us many steps backwards. And there are already a number of properties that are well on that path because of changes to state legislation and a tax incentive. So that is one route. And whether it's that or most of City of Yes that enables that type of thing, the real focus on implementation is critical, which can include but not limited to ensuring construction safety, of course. But that's a big piece of it, and it's well underway, and the accountability that is necessary from the public, from stakeholders, to make sure that those programs and all of those new tools actually get implemented is also something we rarely talk about, because it's not that exciting, but if we don't ensure the implementation of those tools, then the next time that we have to work with communities and legislators to say we need more, it becomes that much harder, because those promises will not have been kept, in my opinion.
Sorry, could I just clarify? Outside of City of Yes and everything that's converting right now, kind of focusing on Class B and C commercial office buildings that may not qualify for City Yes, or it's too much of a capital expenditure for the current landlord to convert the building.
I'm so sorry to do this. It's a great question. You may have to take your answer offline, because we are truly out of time. But I just want to thank you all. If you could all join me in a round of applause for our amazing panelists. Thank you all so much. Maria, I'm sure you can talk about Class B and C office buildings for a whole other hour, but truly thank you all. I really appreciate your thoughts and your time.
Thank you.
Molly?